How are we today, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to weeks 7 and 8 of the Album a Day project. Not much has changed in terms of the format, although this will be the last 2 week interval, since in the future I think it'd be better to do them 1 week at a time. I just hadn't had the chance to do it previously since I was actually out of province last weekend. The 17th marked when the COVID travel restrictions got lifted for my province. And given that I was triple vaxxed, I said, I haven't seen my dad in 4 months since my birthday in October, so I took the chance to go visit them that I could. But except for that one inconvenience, these videos will be weekly on a go forward basis since I have Friday, Saturday off, and Friday marks the last day in a week normally. Give me the chance to do these a bit more frequently, which is very important since the next 2 weeks are both artist slash label deep dives. Next week will be, I'm going to actually tilt the camera down here a little bit. There we go. Next week will be Kate Bush's full discography minus the albums she said she wasn't proud of, which I forget the name of off the top of my head, and the latest record she had put out, which was a rehashing of that record with a few live versions. Um, I wanted to cover the largest amount of her discography as far as original work is concerned that I could, while still being able to best capture the artistic vision. So I did 8 albums total, two of which landed on the Monday, so those will be covered at least in the same breath. And then an album a day for each of the rest of them, covering 8 of the 10 albums that she had put out. And then the second week is for Griselda, the rap label, most known for Conway, Benny the Butcher, and West Side Gun, as well as a few of their friends. I have 2 affiliate albums and then 5 albums from the main 3. So looking forward to that. Anyway, these 2 weeks that we have in store, the first week, week 7, being Boomer Week, mostly just because I wanted to listen to A Love Supreme on Valentine's Day, and I built a week around that. So yeah, I could have also fit it for the week of July 4th, because that would be funnier. But sometimes you take I guess bits of passion over bits of comedy. Anyway, that will be the first week we cover, and then the second is the indie week. I'm going to basically be alternating between a month where I do more genre focused, less concentrated themed weeks, and then on the odd months I'll be doing artists, labels, so on. So look forward to more of that in the future. Anyway, with all the intro out of the way and all the opening fluff, let's get on with the show. To start this week off, we had Boston by Boston, obviously. They're self titled. This album was quite good altogether. Some of the best dad rock from its era, for sure. I was recommended this album by my friend Zem. This, along with an album in Indie Week the week following, will be recommendations of his, and I'll mention that one when it gets around to it. But I will just say this album, obvious classics on it. More Than the Feeling is a song I'm pretty sure everyone knows, and Foreplay Long Time has a similar amount of ubiquity but to a lower scale. Those 2 tracks, obvious classics, but I was surprised by how much I've been coming back to tracks like Hitch a Ride and Peace of Mind. Those two especially were great demonstrations of my theory that albums are always worth listening to, even if you are familiar with the singles. Since those 2 songs actually ended up ranking a little bit higher than More Than the Feeling had in terms of overall quality on me, at least. Front to back, though, this album is pretty much just gems nonstop. There wasn't any tracks that made me question why I was listening to the album, nor were there any that felt like they were out of place or of a noticeably worse quality. So as a result, I would give this album a 9 out of 10. It's a great classic. Sorry, throat's fucking me up. Uh, Great classic overall. Some of the best dad rock from its era for sure. Just not anything I would herald as perfect or even near flawless. Since there were a couple moments on this album that kind of just blended together. But that's not to say anything about the quality, more so just to say the sound is a bit ubiquitous from cover to cover. Next up, following a very strong start to the week, we have In Rock by Deep Purple, also just referred to as Deep Purple in Rock, depending on where you're looking. This album is a heavier twist to the typical boomer rock, and I think it mostly works to the album's favor. Tracks like the opener Speed King and Living Wreck were tracks that I had very much enjoyed, covered or well, front to back on the entire duration of the runtime. Although a couple of the tracks on this album were a bit, not to say difficult to distinguish from one another, it's just they didn't have that concrete of a start or an end, so they felt like they kind of blended together to a certain extent. Um, but there are a lot of little quirks thrown into this album that give it a lot more charm than a few of its contemporaries. The aforementioned Living Wreck has a few weird guitar effects on it that weren't exactly common at this time that help add a lot of charm to it. So that gives it a little bit more replay value. And then, obviously, as we become more and more distant from this chronologically, the influences of this album become more and more obvious. Although their contemporaries, Black Sabbath, were arguably more influential and of greater quality, this is still a remarkable album in the progression of metal as a whole, and very much a great proto metal album. As far as this era is concerned, would very much recommend it. 8 out of 10 overall. Very few complaints to be had total. Couldn't recommend it strongly enough to anyone who wanted to get into the roots of a genre that they love, or maybe metal just didn't click with you and you're trying to give the earlier stuff a shot. It's definitely something I would recommend if you fit either of those bills. Next up, following up the genesis of one genre to the peak of another, comes my favorite free jazz record that I've heard thus far, A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. Admittedly, my toes haven't been dipped that far into free jazz specifically, with much of what I had heard being the obvious classics like Giant Steps, some of Coltrane's contemporaries, and mostly just free jazz radio autoplay on streaming services. So names and things like that aren't too familiar with me, but I'm still very familiar. Well, not very, but familiar enough with the acoustic palette of the genre to make the definitive statement of this album being one of its all-time greats. Words obviously can't describe jazz that well since it relies a lot on the emotion and the expression of the artists themselves. But that having been said, this album still does a very good job at getting that across. The drummer exploding in and out of the background on many of the movements on this album, which is split into four parts. The saxophonist belting out all the raw emotion that really powers and drives the album forward, and then the pianist serving as a chaotic yet consistent backbone throughout it all. Really shows just how good the chemistry is between these artists. I couldn't pick out a favorite of the four movements on the record since I feel like they're best enjoyed as one, and jazz is the kind of thing that having it blend together is normally part of the point. So even though there are still clear cuts on the tracks on this, they're still meant to be listened front to back. And as a result, I won't necessarily pick a favorite. But I feel like the middle section was a bit stronger than the opener, and the closer almost brought me to tears due to how powerful it was. But all that to say, perfect record, 10 out of 10. Jesus fuck, it's John Coltrane. Do I need to say any more? Moving on. Following what was arguably the peak of this 2 week session, comes probably definitely the lowest point if I'm trying to review the music objectively, but a bit of a sour spot otherwise. Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits. There's a lot of yikesy shit on the lyrics for Money for Nothing, but it's been talked to death, so I'm not going to bring that up as a counterpoint to the album or anything. It's jarring and it kind of tainted my experience, but the quality of the album was good enough to bring me back in, so time-wise, obviously, things will happen. I'm not going to play defense for the band at all, and it should definitely be criticized for what it is, but that point's been talked to death, and this is more about the music itself and less about the subject matter, so either way. That aside, that little rant aside, the rest of the album has definitely aged a lot better. Walk of Life, obviously, everyone knows the synth line on that album. It's so iconic, or on that track rather. It's so iconic. And the title track, Brothers in Arms itself, was a much noted increase in quality. The closing run of three tracks, ending in the title track was great. The opening three being, oh God, I forgot the name of the opener, but the opening track, Money for Nothing, and then Walk Life, absolutely fucking incredible. Just the middle section of the album left a lot to be desired in terms of sticking power. It is still quality instrumentation. It's still quite good overall. It just didn't sit with me in the same way that a lot of the other stuff that I've listened to through this project has. And as a result, the rating does seem a little low in comparison. But keep in mind that a 7.5, which is what I gave this record, is still good, but not quite great. So it would still be something that I would recommend to the average person, especially to anyone who wants to get a bit more familiar with this era of music. Um, I would personally recommend if you wanted to check out Dire Straits to start with their first album. I'm not sure if it was a self-titled, but it's the album that has Sultans of Swing on it, which is the track that everyone knows them for. Uh, I've heard that album is a lot more consistent in terms of quality, and from what I've picked out of it, it does seem to be a lot more so. But I haven't listened to it cover to cover, so I couldn't vouch 100% on the quality. Anyway, 7.5 out of 10. We move on from something that was disappointing despite being good to something that is surprising in just how amazing it is. We have Face Value by Phil Collins. Good fucking lord. I don't have words to describe the sheer bliss this album gave me on a first listen. Just his voice so evocative. The momentum used in the tracks carries a lot more emotion than it has any right to. There's a lot of subtlety to the production on tracks, like especially the obvious opener. God, how's the in the air tonight? How did it escape me? Such an iconic track. Either way, in the air tonight, all build up and then such an explosive bombast for conclusion. Really demonstrates a lot of what this album is going for. But I would argue a few tracks do demonstrate that a bit better. Hand in Hand, The Roof is Leaking, and Thunder and Lightning being my top three, with the run from The Roof is Leaking through Thunder and Lightning being one of the best runs of all time. I genuinely just wish I could listen to this album for a first time again. I need to give Phil Collins more respect too. I was aware of how good he was and just kind of wrote it off as another uh, all-time great that I would just respect but not necessarily get around to. Uh, Good Lord, do I need to? Ooh, excuse me. It is 10 p.m. as I film this, and I worked an 8-hour shift today, so a little tired. Forgive me. But I I don't really have any criticism I can give to this album. I know there are obviously flaws, since the album was remastered, and remasters, whatever, they increase the quality of the tracks, but do they really increase the quality? Um, I don't know what I can say about this album in terms of anything negative, really. It sits perfectly with me, really, and that's why I'm justified giving this not just a 10 out of 10, but probably the top spot of albums I've listened to thus far. Um, that I hadn't already been familiar with. Um, Phil Collins, absolutely incredible. Please give me more suggestions of his. I need to get into his discog more, and I don't know. Obviously, the bands he's worked with and the Tarzan soundtrack are a good entry point. But in terms of his actual music, I'm not overtly familiar, so any suggestions would be much appreciated. Um, Surprisingly, from this, we don't have a step down in quality, but an even level. So we will move on to the next album. Continuing on in terms of the stream of raw quality that this series has been pumping into me, we have Voulez-Vous by Abba. This album had me hooked right from the start. The bass line on As Good as New uh, had me pulled in right away, and it had my full attention cover to cover. The incredible vocal harmonies from this group, as anyone would expect, are top notch, and it's what they're remembered for. But there's just so many highlights on this album. The run of the title track Voulez-Vous through The King Has Lost His Crown and the closing three-track streak were just fantastic. But Angel Eyes, especially, was a song that I very much liked that I really wasn't expecting to. ABBA has been talked to death in the past, and although they are very much iconic, a lot of their music is just trademark pop. So it's difficult to add much substance to a group that is known for adding a lot of substance to what is admittedly a substance minimal genre as far as history goes. But 10 out of 10 again, an excellent follow up to the previous album, and not much more to say. I unfortunately, as much as I love this album and have gone back to it many times since I listened to it on the 17th, so 11 days ago, I've probably listened to it 3 times since then. And I just don't have much to say because I feel like it speaks for itself, if that makes sense. Abba's work does that a lot since they're just such a high reputation throughout the not just with pop music fans, but throughout the music industry as a whole. It's crazy to think that this album and a lot of their music was made in spite of all the chemistry issues that the band had. The minute the recording started, all of that feels like it just disappeared. Uh, so again, 10 out of 10. Can't iterate enough how much I like this album, and I don't want to sound redundant, so we'll just move on. And concluding what was a surprisingly good and diverse week, from what I was expecting of a boomer week, we have Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones. Let It Bleed was the other one I could have gone with, but I was too familiar with the songs on that album, so I decided to go with this one instead. And I'm really glad I did, since I had only heard a couple of their hits prior to this, outside of tracks on Let It Bleed. Um, Good Lord, did this sonically take me by surprise. Tracks like Wild Horses, Dead Flowers, and You Gotta Move were very refreshing compared to a lot of the heavier texture that some of their other work is painted with. Um, and then gems like Can't You Hear Me Knockin' and Bitch are obviously incredible, with the brass on the former contrasting very well with a very, very good guitar solo. The keyboard solo on I Got the Blues as well was just seamless. The Stones are good. I don't need to say this, and I feel like a lot of this week, just due to the ubiquity of a lot of older music, has been a lot of redundancy. But this album very much speaks for itself. I would very much recommend it if you think you have an idea of what the Stones' music is like. Give this one a shot. If you're familiar with their music, give this one a re-listen. It's almost perfect. Just a couple of moments on it dragged me out of it, and even then, they were ever so slight that it up there with Wings in terms of, or Band on the Run rather by Wings in terms of quality for something relative. 9.5 out of 10 overall. Oh, man, I need to listen to this album again. So that caps off Boomer Week. Next up, we have Indie Week, which starts off with an album I was very much expecting to like a bit less than I did. But I feel like a lot of that has to do with the production. I'll get into that in a second here. It's Funeral by Arcade Fire. This album was a very warm and nostalgic listen, despite being almost entirely unfamiliar with their music, aside from a couple hits that they had. Uh, Obviously, Arcade Fire is very, very well known in indie circles, but I just haven't looked too much into them. So this was a very refreshing excuse me, a very strong introduction to them and a very refreshing listen overall. The last 3 tracks were an incredible suite, and there's so much emotion on the closer. Um, just in general, the vocals on this album are incredible. The production's quite good. A lot of it has very obviously been influencing music since its release. But indie is a very self-referential genre, I feel, since it is so wide. So there will always be an album you can point to as the genesis of a few different things. Um, that being said, though, I very much did enjoy this one, and I yet again need to give it a proper listen before, or a proper re-listen before I give a concrete opinion on it. But in the meantime, this will get a 9 out of 10, and that will be one of them marked for potential updates later on in the sheet that I have in the description for any of you wanting to follow along with me. Next up, if you guys remember a couple of weeks ago, I did have an album cover that I needed to censor. So to avoid going with that, I went with the North American version of this one. Is This It by the Strokes? Obviously, the other cover is suggestive at worst, but I still didn't want to risk it since YouTube is iffy on a good day. As I mentioned with Arcade Fire, the influences this band has left behind are incredibly obvious, with much of modern indie adjacent rock showing splashes of this album. I got into Spirit of the Beehive last year, and there's traces of this and other groups that I'll be discussing later on, all throughout their music. So As a bit of an anecdote, once the closer of this album had finished, an Arctic Monkeys song came on, and I genuinely couldn't tell it apart from the Strokes, except for after the first 90 seconds. Um, Casablancas' delivery is fucking incredible, as always. The bass work is some of the best in the genre. My first exposure to the band was through Reptilia, which I feel was the case for most people who didn't grow up with this album, since Rock Band influenced a lot of my generation's music access. But that being the only frame of reference I had for this band, this blew me away, genuinely. There are so many songs on this that I've just been coming back to over and over. My playlist right now is littered with up here, most notably the title track and Last Night. Last Night especially, God, I've probably put 15 plays into that so far. Uh, Fantastic track, fantastic album. Uh, this album's been talked to death as well, so I'm going to try not to be redundant when I say that indie rock is very strong, and this is a great declaration of that, especially in the more moody, melancholic side of it, at least. Not to say it's devoid of emotion, but more to say that it's very much aware of what it is, and I think it does a great job at carrying that forward. Moving on. We have the other album I mentioned earlier that was recommended to me by Zem, Crack Up by Fleet Foxes. This album was absolutely incredible. Front to back, the guitar playing is completely mesmerizing. The vocalist carries so much soul and emotion, and the guitar, as mentioned, helps accentuate a lot of the tones the tracks are going for. Um, I will say this album was a bit differentiate to tell, or a bit difficult to differentiate the tracks on an initial listen. But I was actually discussing with Zem after the fact, and he said that this is an album that is a grower, not a shower. So if it put out this strong of a first impression, I know it will 100% grow on me. 9 out of 10 overall. Will definitely need a revisit to have a more, I guess, a more detailed opinion. But for now, this definitely shows a lot of promise for Fleet Foxes, and it definitely makes me interested to check more of their work out, not just re-listen to this one. So look forward to some of their music maybe in the future. Next up, continuing the trend of pure quality as far as indie goes, we have Yankee Hotel Foxtrot by Wilco, funny 4chan album. I hate that site so much. Why does it have to taint so much of music's discussion? Anyway, God, what an album. Words are hard to put towards this album in specific, but the instrumentation was obviously incredible, doing a lot to accentuate the atmosphere and give the vocalist a lot more room to breathe in the mix, since while not totally present in a lot of the tracks, they do still very much have their presence felt. Jesus, etc., is the obvious standout for me, with their use of strings outside of the guitar. Violins aren't very common in music. At least I believe that's a violin. Could be a cello. Could be I don't know string instruments that well. But non-traditional string instruments, or I guess classical string instruments, if you want to be more accurate, always add a lot to production. It's one of the reasons I'm a huge advocate of the piano in general. It adds a lot more texture to tracks than we can even expect, and it brings a lot of replay value to it, since the more you listen to it, the more you understand the mastery on display. Whereas with guitars, since they're a lot more ubiquitous and a lot more well understood by the average person, they are a bit easier to differentiate or isolate in terms of greatness, at least. Um, Hot Kettle Black through Reservations was an extremely powerful way to end the album as well. Generally, just front to back had me invested. Can't really complain about any moments on this record either, but it didn't have as much memorability to it, or um, it didn't have that extra oomph that a lot of records that end up going down is in the higher ranks of my ratings go. So I will still give it a 9 out of 10, since I loved it cover to cover, and it was an incredible first experience. But many of the tracks didn't exactly leave me interested in revisiting them, albeit still fantastic on a first listen. So 9 out of 10 for this one. Definitely cannot complain. Will definitely update my thoughts on the sheet once I give it a re-listen. But for now, 9 out of 10, concrete and confident in that. Going from an album that left me without many words to an album that left me completely speechless, we have For Emma Forever Ago by Bon Iver. Justin Vernon's voice could lift the soul out of me, and I could not complain if I tried. Absolute masterpiece on display here from Vernon and Co. Uh, Most notably, Lump Sum, Skinny Love, and the closing two of For Emma into Restacks. I cried on two different occasions in this album, and it wasn't even like a sad cry necessarily. It's just the raw power that Justin has in his voice, incomparable to anything else. And this is going to come bite me in the ass later when I do a Taylor Swift week because I promised one of my friends I would. But he makes Taylor Swift's music listenable, so that's the biggest praise I can give. Um, Jokes aside, though, there is just so much heart here, so much soul, that feels like the more this album is discussed, the less people will really feel about it. So instead of spoiling too much about it, just cover to cover, give it a listen, and let yourself feel just the pure beauty of this album. 22 a Million is definitely going to end up on one of these lists later down the line for the record. And if that doesn't, I'll hold future me accountable, but whatever, fuck it, that'll be a problem then. 10 out of 10 here. Words don't describe it, like I mentioned. Please just do yourself a favor, give it a listen. And if you have give it a listen, I don't care what you're doing. Give it a re-listen after this. You will be thankful, and I hope it doesn't ruin your day. Because boy, does it hit in a certain way if you're not really in the right headspace for it. But goddamn, so wonderful, man. Justin Vernon, why did you have to do this to me? I'm never gonna recover. Following up on the trend of back-to-back masterpieces that seems to have come up in this section, we have Dr. Head's World Tour by Flipper's Guitar. Anywhere I found this album online said it was World Tour, not World Tower, but then I saw the album cover itself and it was World Tower. So yeah, internet seems to have fucked that one up. But all that to say, Flipper's Guitar are an incredibly eclectic group. If you haven't heard of them before, unsurprising, if you have heard of them before, you either know a fair bit about Shibuya Kei or you've done the bare minimum research to get familiar with Japanese music, since they are fairly well known within the 90s era of the genre. Their brand of indie leans on a combination of city pop, blues rock, shoegaze, and the aforementioned Shibuya Kei, which they had been one of the founding pillars of. And it is such an interesting, unique blend of sound. Nothing showcases that better, though, than the stretch of Dolphin Song through Going Zero, since each of those songs are unique in their own right, and they all add a lot of good quality to the album in terms of diversity, which makes it a very interesting re-listen. Since I had heard this album for the first time on the 25th, so 2 days ago, and I've already listened to it 3 times since. So that should be quite a strong indication of the quality. But I do get hooked on albums pretty easily, so keep that in mind. It's actually gotten better with each re-listen, in my opinion. The closer grows on me every time. Blue Shine and Quick Blur, Sonic joke aside, is a fantastic track. Groove Tube being the standout on the project, it's probably the song that, if you are familiar with any of this group, you would be aware of. But that and Blue Shine and Quickstar, as I mentioned earlier, were both on a singles album that I'd heard previously on Spotify. So if you're looking to get into this group, that singles album would be a good place to start, since it's one of few that are available on streaming readily. This isn't even on YouTube Music. I had to go to a YouTube bootleg upload to be able to listen to it. So audio quality was kind of bummed, unfortunately, but I'm not spending $1,000 on a vinyl for an album I've never listened to, and I honestly don't have $1,000 to spend on a vinyl to begin with. So we'll have to stick with bootlegging for now. That being said, I'm definitely saving up for the vinyl of this at one point, because it is one for the ages. 10 out of 10. Words won't do the closer justice either, the closer being the title track. Please give this one a listen if there's anything I can say about this video so far. I know I've said that God knows how many times by now, but given the fact that this is a group that not many people would be familiar with, even within the indie sphere, unless you've gone out of the way to do research into Sweet like I mentioned earlier. Um, give this one a listen. It's so good. Uh, there's just so much done in this album that I haven't heard elsewhere. And listening to Cornelius, one of their members, is future albums like Phantasma. Um, there's so many obvious influences in this album to his later work that it's just era defining more than anything. It perfectly encapsulates what at least I had expected from 90s Japan music and or 90s Japanese music, I should say. Japan music, that's very objectifying. But all that to say, perfect record. I hope I have this in my vinyl collection at some point before it ends up costing a down payment on a house. And with that, we have but one record left, and we're still ending on a strong note, although not to the same heights as the past two. Still one worth listening to. So we shall move on to that now. As I mentioned, keeping up the quality, we have Interpol's "Turn on the Bright Lights." This album combines a lot of the production aesthetics of shoegaze, which was kind of a carryover from the last one, with the wave of Britpop from the 90s. Groups like the Boo Radleys, Oasis, and Blur, and the like. This album, well, not somewhat, very obviously inspired by a lot of those groups. Somewhat acoustically similar, but derivative enough in its own regard that it does a lot to bring new energy to the table, to bring new musical value, I guess, so to say. Um, the tracks had an oddly warm tone to them too. Uh, Obstacle 1 and 2 were the main takeaways for me. Both incredible tracks. PDA, another obvious standout, and Stella Was a Diver. Such a good song. This album I listened to on my way to work this morning, the 28th, so I've been slacking a little bit, unfortunately. But it was the highlight of my morning without a doubt, and it made the fact that I was working an 8-hour shift today not a problem because I was in the right headspace for it. After this album started my day off on the right foot. The closing 3-track run following Stella Was a Diver, starting with let me put it up here, starting with Roland and ending with Leif Erikson. Incredible altogether. Definitely added a bit more spice to the album than I was expecting. Although they are somewhat similar to the tracks earlier, they do carry their own merit, especially the new, which justifies its 6-minute runtime quite well. It feels like there wasn't really a moment wasted on this album, but it does feel like they could have, if they were a bit more ambitious, done a bit more with it. So as a result, I don't feel it maximized its potential, but it's still as far as I can say, a very high quality album altogether. A 9 out of 10 cover to cover on this one. Would definitely recommend it among all the other ones. So with that wrapped up, let's move to the final scores for this section. All right, so closing that off, beautiful series of albums here, especially from here down. It is pure quality all the way. Not a single miss. These two albums here, Brothers in Arms and Deep Purple in Rock. Sorry, I'm just looking at my camera on OBS as I'm doing this, so apologies if the hand gestures are a little fucking childish, but it's easier for me to follow if I know what I'm doing. Anyway, those two albums didn't disappoint me at all. They just didn't leave the same like mouth agape sheer awe that a lot of the other albums had. I was half tempted to throw a Vanilla Fudge album in Boomer Week, but their self-titled was the only album I had really stumbled across, and I had listened to it on a whim one night in early February. So it felt dishonest to revisit a record I already had. That being said, though, I would definitely recommend checking them out. They aren't exactly analogous to anything on here, but they are definitely another good album from that era, or another good band from that era to check out. You Keep Me Hanging On is beautiful. I don't have words for it. Uh, but yeah, speaking of not having words, that's something I do struggle with a lot of the time with music. Is struggling to formulate my opinion in a way that isn't just this made me feel X or element of why song was good. So whether it be a goal of mine throughout the series or just something that comes naturally, I do hope my ability to communicate just how music makes me feel, or uh, I guess the way that I perceive it. I just hope the way I communicate that improves over the series. It's something that I've been working on, and obviously, given the circumstances this being recorded in, it's 11 p.m. right now. I've been up for 16 hours. Far from ideal, but when you have motivation, you jump on it, because then you'll just be kicking yourself in the ass if you don't. So that's why this is being done, in spite of, albeit my better judgment. Um, anyway, all that to say, um, thanks to anyone who has watched this, or thanks to anyone who watches the series in general. Next Friday or Saturday, most likely Saturday, since I do at least want to give myself a bit of time to go over it and make sure it's proper. I'll be putting in my video on Kate Bush's discography, and then the week following that, we'll see a video on Griselda, the rap label that I had mentioned earlier, with Conway the Machine, Benny the Butcher, and West Side Gun. So, all that to say, thanks to anyone who watched. Any and all feedback is appreciated at all, as always. Whether it's easier to reach me through Discord, server in the invites, or just my Discord is DaxNSR pound 1999. Pretty easy to get a hold of. Any and all feedback's appreciated. Recommendations, as always, please shoot them my way. And any criticism, any recommendations on the format of it, all appreciated. Again, this is all being done kind of experimentally, since I don't have a set idea in mind, more so just a format I'd like to work in, and that's kind of what I've settled on. Um, the album a day being really the core format, how it's delivered, not too picky on. So, yeah, any and all feedback, any and all criticism, etc. Just reach out and I'll do what I can to either attempt to integrate it, or even elaborate on why things are done a certain way. Transparency is key, especially as a small content creator. But yeah, thanks to anyone watching, and I hope you all have a good week. Until next time.